The Honourable Member for Charlottetown Parkdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the things I found most surprising about the recently tabled Electoral System Referendum Act was that the Referendum Commissioner would hold office from June 1st, 2018. That isn't much more than 2 weeks away. A question to the Premier: what is the urgency for appointing the Commissioner right away?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the point of tabling this legislation was to ensure that there was a level playing field, clear ground rules, and Mr. Speaker, a key part of that is the appointment through this Legislative Assembly, through legislative management, of a referendum commissioner, and indeed to have that commissioner in place as this process goes forward, as the bill is passed, or as the law presumably will be adopted by this legislature with or without amendments. Then to have the commissioner in place, it's obvious that that will enable the law to be implemented. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. The Honourable Member of Charlottetown Parkdale, your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So with these timelines, I must assume that you've already somebody in mind for this position. A question to the Premier: have you already identified our future referendum commissioner from the comfort of the fifth floor?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I won't make any comment on the comfort of the fifth floor. I think the members opposite have tried to make it as uncomfortable as possible. But Mr. Speaker, this is something, as is clear on the face of the bill, that will be dealt with by legislative management and will be further considered and only put in place with a 2/3 vote of this Assembly, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Premier. Honourable Member, Charlottetown Parkdale, your second supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Legislative Management Committee must make a recommendation for the Commissioner, but the committee is controlled by government members and meets behind closed doors. So again to the Premier, have you instructed your government members of the Legislative Management Committee to rubber stamp your choice for Commissioner?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, no, I have not. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Next question from the Honourable Member of Charlottetown Parkdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the past, when the Legislative Management Committee was put in charge of recommending the appointment of an officer for the legislature, they have advertised for the position, used a rigorous interview process to establish qualifications, but the timelines provided in this legislation would not allow that process to unfold. If we abide by the fixed election date legislation, I see no need whatsoever for such rigid and accelerated timeframes. There is absolutely no rush here. Premier, can you confirm for this House that there will indeed be no election this fall?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, on the question that led to the further piece that was asked here about the timing, I would not describe it as a rush, Mr. Speaker. I believe there is a good reason, and it's evident on the face of things, and certainly if you look at the experience we had with the plebiscite in 2016, Mr. Speaker, when this bill becomes law, whatever changes are made on the floor of this House, there's an obvious need to have a referendum commissioner and for the participants in the process of the referendum to proceed by the rules, and I took the third party to be in favour of that idea that there would be clear rules, that there'd be a level playing field, and that's exactly what this bill does, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Member of Charlottetown Parkdale, your first supplementary on your second question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned earlier, the Legislative Management Committee is controlled by government members and meets behind closed doors. This can lead to dubious and self-serving decisions, such as rejecting key recommendations by the Conflict of Interest Commissioner. Again to the Premier, how do we expect there to be public confidence in this appointment if there is no application or screening process and the decision is made by government members in secret?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I have confidence in the Legislative Management Committee and in its chair and in the good faith with which the members of this House meet, as they have done for many, many years, with the confidence of doing so in camera and with the reasons that are behind that. And Mr. Speaker, I don't know that it's very helpful to all of the courtesy and the good grace that we expect in this chamber and the way that we do work together through legislative management to use the language that we've just heard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Premier. The Honourable Member, Charlottetown Parkdale, your second supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you can imagine, the rumour mill is working overtime speculating on who the Premier has handpicked to be the Commissioner. The name I've heard more than once is former Chief Justice Gerard Mitchell. A question to the Premier: is the rumour mill correct, or have you chosen someone else to be the referendum Commissioner?
Honourable Premier.
Now, Mr. Speaker, first we have to pass the bill, at which point the Legislative Management Committee will have a job to do, at which point this legislature will have a job to do to consider a resolution. And at that point, Mr. Speaker, perhaps the rumour mill will move on to something else. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.